And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
Welcome to Mob Talk Radio. Now, every once in a while, and this is probably not going to be very popular amongst people, but everything is factual, whether you want to agree with it or not. In organized crime, there's street politics. And we've talked a lot on our paid podcast about mob politics and what role they play in crime families. As you know, we have discussed the three captains' murders, which basically was mob politics and how Joey Massino used lies. As far as the three captains stockpiling weapons to be used against him as a way to murder his way to the top of the food chain. So at times, what I often try to do to make it more simplified is to bring in an example of mob politics that leads to like horrible events. As we know, Vito Genovese was a big mob politicker, especially when it came to other things. Albert Anastasia was a politicker too, especially when it came to Meyer Lansky and some other people. However, politics is just a large part of organized crime. Alignment for both power and money is everything. The commission, the power to control the commission is everything. It simply means that in disputes, the side with the most power, albeit voting, wins. So if somebody brings a beef and they're outvoted, they lose. And all bosses, including Lucky Luciano, Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, they all use that to their advantage. There's nothing wrong with using that to your advantage. John Gotti attempted to and failed miserably doing that, igniting a war within the Colombo crime family. Politics was just not John Gotti's strong suit at all. So as history tells us, in 1985, Carmine Perisco, Jerry Langella, and 7 others would be indicted for murder, narcotics, loan sharking, gambling, labor racketeering, and extortion against construction companies as a sweeping part of the commission trial. All would be found guilty and sent away. The Colombo crime family actually took more damage than any other crime family at that particular trial. Persico receives a 139-year sentence. Jerry Langella got 165 years. Alphonse Persico would actually get 12 years as a result of that case. So while Carmine Perisco wanted Alphonse to take over, what ends up happening is Alphonse ends up skipping bail on a loan sharking arrest. And so there you go. So even if Carmine knew getting 139 years in prison, his days of being on the streets were over, he still wanted to control the family, and he still wanted to ensure that all of the money that they were making went to his family, which any boss in their right mind would want. So with Persico in prison, and the Colombos taking the most damage from that particular trial, Persico installs a 3-man ruling panel. He installs Benedetto Aloy, Vinny Angelino, and Joe Tomasello. Carmine Perisco would actually disband that ruling panel in 1988, and he would name Vic Orena the acting boss, which was only meant to be a temporary position until Alley Boy Persico could get out of prison. Persico would then give Orena 2 specific powers. He could induct members and he could carry out murders, which most bosses were not willing to sort of give to other men. So it is what it is. And what ends up beginning to happen is that Orena begins to feel the power of being a boss. What Orena does is he begins to expand the Colombo crime family into other areas, and he begins to build a bond with John Gotti, and he aligns the two families loosely on some major different rackets. So in other words, the Gambinos and the Colombos begin to work a little bit on some rackets. Orena, in short order, had the Colombos running pretty smoothly. Like anything else in life, power goes to one's head. And while I can't disagree with Orena's stance, I mean, he's the guy who's out on the streets. He's the guy making daily decisions. He's making the family a ton of money. He's bridging relationships with other families. But the problem is with that is you have Carmine Perisco, who just does not want to relinquish control. Eventually, Orena would stop clearing day-to-day things with Persico, leading Persico to wonder if he had made the right decision. On the other end of that spectrum was that Orena felt that Persico was out of touch, and because Orena wanted to expand and Persico didn't really want to go that far with certain things, mainly narcotics, it meant that Orena and others were going to lose out on a ton of money. So in 1991, word began to trickle out that Carmine Perisco was allegedly negotiating with a film company for the rights of his biography, which would appear on television. The problem is there has been zero, I mean nothing to substantiate that claim. And I often wonder if Orena made it up or if he was just told that by somebody else. And you can look at it several ways. But there has never been one single shred of evidence to support that claim. But this is where street politics come into play. If Carmine Perisco was writing a book, or if he was even doing an interview, the mob looked at that as a rat move, bottom line. But bosses and men in hierarchies have a different responsibility, and that responsibility is they have to know the difference between fact and fiction. But they often will use lies to propel their own wants and desires. That's just the bottom line. Anybody that wants to sit there on their pulpit and say, "Oh, mob bosses are all honest." I mean, come on, get real. It's organized crime, okay? So Vic Orena was no different in that regard. And he is using what he has at his disposal. It's the one way that he can get Carmine Perisco out of the way, through the commission. Orena ends up sitting down with John Gotti over that particular issue, and Gotti was all for the removal of Persico. In fact, after that meeting, Gotti put it out that Persico was a rat, and he sent his little lackey, Jackie D'Amico, to tell everybody that Persico was a rat and an informant. And it would be necessary because word needed to filter out in order to get the commission on board. And Gotti had his reasons too. For starters, during this time, Gotti had bonded with Joey Massino, who was in control now of the Bonanno crime family. And Massino had basically been in charge on the streets since 1985, and he basically takes over the streets when Rusty Rastelli goes away on a racketeering beef, and etc. Rastelli ends up dying in prison in 1991. He ends up dying in 1991, making Massino the official boss. Now, Gotti and Massino went way back. And it was John Gotti who disposed of the bodies of Dominic Trinchera, Sonny Redondelicato, and Phil Giacone. It's been alleged that Gotti used a van, pick up the bodies, and dump them in the hole, the infamous mob graveyard. Massino and Gotti had grown close and often sided with one another over beefs and politics. That relationship wouldn't end that way, but that's where it was during this time period. So in the background, Gotti had his detractors too. Gotti used to bemoan and make fun of Vinny Gigante and his whole nut act because it's been said that Gotti often wondered out loud to his men how any man could allow himself to be demeaned in public like that. But I'm going to point out a very good fact. 5 years on the streets versus 30 years on the streets. So say what you want about Vinny the Chin, but he had longevity. Gotti had desires to control the commission, and for good reason. He had Joey Massino on his side, but the problem was that the Bonannos could not vote in commission meetings. They had lost that right as a result to Joe Pistone or Donnie Brasco. Therefore, he had their support off the record, but off the record doesn't do you any good in a commission vote. Gotti needed the Colombos on his side. He had to try to even it up. He had to at least pull somebody to his side of the fence. And he had no choice, because Vincent Gigante was too strong for him. So on the commission, you had the Lucchese's aligned with the Genovese crime family. You had the Gambinos aligned with the Bonanos, but in reality, it doesn't really matter because they didn't have a say in any vote, and it meant very little, which is why Gotti needed the Colombos so badly. At least then in a commission vote, Gotti had a chance, a 2-2 split, which then would mean someone would have to come in and mitigate what that final decision would be. And it was Gotti's only chance of being not outvoted on the commission. And this is why Gotti backs Orena completely. If Gotti can help remove Persico, because Persico would never back Gotti in a million years. He didn't like John Gotti, and I know that for a fact. And he knew that John had sent word on the streets that he was a rat. And it meant that Gotti had an ally on the commission if he can get rid of Persico and make Orena the boss. But the Lucchese's and the Genovese were too strong. So after word spread, Gotti would suggest to Orena that he petition the commission to back him as boss, but prior he needed him to go and poll his captains for the takeover, which is very similar to what John Gotti did prior to murdering Paul Castellano or ordering the death of Paul Castellano. And the problem was twofold. Number one, the commission refused to sanction any regime change. The Colombos had already had 2 wars. They didn't want any problem, but Gigante and Tony Ducks are not about to give John Gotti any power. There just, number one, wasn't any proof that Persico was a rat. They wanted proof. There was none. So that's the first reason why they say no. And 2, Gigante and Tony Ducks knew that Gotti and Orena, that he knew what they were up to. And they weren't about to give that up. The second issue was Orena stupidly tells Carmine Sessa, who turns out to be an informant down the road, but at the time was the consigliere, to go out and poll the captains. But that's not what Carmine Sessa does. He goes right back to Greg Scarpa, tells him what's going on, and that message filters back to Carmine Persico. When word gets back to Persico, he orders the death of Vic Orena immediately. June 21st of 1991, Orena was heading home, and he spots shooters outside of his house. In retaliation, all hell would break loose. 12 people would be killed. 18 associates would go missing. As a result of that war, 80 men from both sides of the Colombos would be arrested, indicted, or end up in prison. So while John Gotti didn't fire a weapon, Gotti gave Orena all he needed to instigate that war. Whatever Gotti had hoped to get in return for the Colombo side of things, he totally underestimated Carmine Persico. One may argue without Gotti's prodding that Orena might not have done what he did. But we honestly can't say that. Orena was his own man. He made decisions on his own, but he was being prodded by a very strong boss in Gotti, who only backed Orena for his own power grab, and it backfired. Now, there's going to be those that are going to say John Gotti didn't dispose of bodies from the three captains' hits. But he did. But ask yourself this. Not only did Mikey Scars testify to that, he testified to Gotti instigating the Colombo War. But also the FBI acting on a tip were led directly to the bodies of the 3 captains in the exact place that this informant told them they would be. That informant was around the Gotti crew, the Gotti regime. And he also told them that John Gotti helped bury them. That informant went by the code name of Wahoo. Wahoo was Willie Boy Johnson. And I know I always say on this show, informants rarely tell the truth, but in this particular case, in this particular situation, if he was lying about that, how come everything he said to them led them to those bodies? It's either that or, boy, he really guessed right, didn't he? So in the end, politics plays a big role in organized crime. Men make decisions based on support, money, and longevity. The most successful men in that life, Patriarca, Gigante, Buffalino, Trafficante, and Gambino, they knew how to weave and wield their power appropriately. They knew when to duck, they knew when to stay out of the limelight, and they never acted too greedy for their own good. And that's one thing about the history. Once again, this is one thing about the history of organized crime. The most successful, those with the longest reigns, are often more apt to spread the wealth and take the cuts because it means mutual respect among their peers and everyone. Better to make some than all of it and not have enemies. For someone who just wants to take the entire cookie jar and leads like a tyrant are the first to be beheaded. And the lesson that you take from history is this. Many are doomed to repeat history, but just ask yourself this question. If your backdoor dealing in politics don't serve the greater purpose, then by proxy, you're doing it for your own greedy selfishness. And those throughout history that have done that don't last very long. Longevity in that life is everything. Success is defined by longevity. Gigante, Patriarca, Buffalino, Trafficante, Marcello, Magaddino. These are men who plotted and spread the wealth. It was about the organization. Gotti, Scarfo, Genovese, Colombo, Capone were gone in a flash. You cannot take away who they were. You cannot say they weren't gangsters. They didn't wear it. You can't say that about them. But when looking at history, the reality is they cannot hold a candle to the others in terms of longevity and leadership. And that's just the truth. It's not a negative aspersion against anyone. It's just literally the cold, hard facts. I am a history buff. I enjoy history. But a lot of things tend to get lost in translation. Now, one of the questions you may have right now is, well, can you fault Gotti for doing that? Absolutely not. I can't at all. He was backed into a corner. What other choice did he have? He wasn't strong enough to battle Vinny the Chin or Tony Ducks. He just wasn't on his own. Massino's vote didn't count, but as we saw, not 3 or 4 years later, Massino wanted to kill John Gotti. Couldn't stand him. And for obvious reasons. But that's the point, is when you are in a position of power, it is a good quality to have when you can be neutral. But when you do things that are impetuous and you back yourself into a corner, and that's not to say that the Gambino crime family was not a tough family. Absolutely they were. But when you do so much and you go too far and you get backed into a corner where you have no other alternative but to try to unseat a boss who is very well respected, who is very powerful even from the can, and you fail miserably at doing that, it says a lot. It just says a lot about organized crime. But there have been others in history. I mean, and if you're looking for a reference point, Carlo Gambino, the combination of Gambino and Lucchese, terrified Joe Bonanno. So much so that he goes to Joe Magliocco, who goes to his hitman, Joe Colombo, and says, we're going to wipe out the whole entire fucking commission. Because we don't know if Vito Genovese is going to go with Gambino. We got a problem. Bonanno was so petrified and so worried about the power of Lucchese and Gambino and possibly Genovese that he decides to wipe out the whole entire commission. And boy, does that backfire. It gets him thrown out of the mafia. Luckily, it didn't get Joe Magliocco killed. But that's history, and that's politics. And that's how everything sort of fleshes out. I get why he did it. I totally understand why he did it. But it backfired, and it backfired horribly. Because even if, let's throw caution to the wind, even if, let's say, he does not back Orena, he's going to have a much bigger problem down the line because Joe Massino is going to switch. And now you have 3 families versus 2. And as unstable as the Colombos had been for the last 20 years, I don't know how long they would have wanted to dilly-dally in that playground either. And that's the history of it. And even though, like I said, he didn't fire a weapon, he didn't force anybody to do anything. In his own way, he's culpable for it because he backed it rather than being someone who saw this as a potential problem. They had already had 2 wars. There was still instability in the family. Rather than uptake the cause of Carmine Perisco, who was a respected boss, rather than say, he's a respected guy, you shit out of luck. It is what it is. He doesn't do that. He doesn't do it. And he puts it out on the street that Carmine's a rat. And that is only going to ignite bloodshed. And he knew it. And in the end, he doesn't get anything out of it. But bosses have done that throughout the history of organized crime. The commission was a big thing. So just thought I would share that. Feel free to send your threats and whatever else to my email, because I'm sure I'll get some, because it seems like anytime you're factual and tell the truth about things, people don't like it. So it is what it is. But that is in no way, shape, or form a negative aspersion on anybody. That's just the streets. That's how the streets work. That's just how the streets work.